Hello, it's Matthew here from the Nations of Sanity project, doing a video for the Together Strong project, which is a project based on bringing people together for common cause. More specifically, this project is about arranging conversations, discussions, and debates between libertarians on different issues so that we can get closer to truth together and help clarify our understandings of the principles that we espouse and believe in. For this particular debate, we're going to have a conversation about punishment, the death penalty, and punishment in general. And I'm very, very grateful for Derek Wills, who's otherwise known as Ancap Air, who's agreed to have this debate with me. I'm calling it a debate. I mean, it will be very civil discussion, I'm sure, but a debate because we seem to be on different sides of this particular issue with regards to the death penalty in particular, but even in the issue of punishment itself. So I wanted to understand Derek's position better, kind of explain any areas where I feel like I do disagree, and obviously hopefully do the same for him with regards to kind of my position. And together, I'm sure we'll get a better understanding of where we're both coming from. So before we kind of kick off into the main debate, I'd like to just sort of say thank you to Derek for taking the time to have this debate and yeah, introduce yourself to people listening.
Well, Matt, thanks for having me. We've been talking about this talking about doing this for a while. So I'm glad that we've finally been able to find time and hammer it in, man. Uh, you know, this is a good conversation to have. Really, any conversation is good to have. And the last time I was here, we had a lot of good conversations around the ANCAP philosophy and things like that. And you know, the way that you present this whole discussion is something that's desperately needed, particularly in libertarian circles, because we seem to hate each other over over everything. And I, despite my best efforts, I'm guilty of that as well, where I have had my fair share of times where I'm calling out somebody not a real libertarian. So I mean, we all do it, and but having a platform like this where the intent is to discuss these types of issues, it's it's wonderful. It's desperately needed, particularly in the libertarian circle. So I appreciate that you have kind of spearheaded this whole thing, and just keep doing what you're doing. This is awesome, and I really appreciate you having me on to do it. So.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate the kind words. And yeah, I mean that is the goal. It is because at the end of the day, we're all human beings. We're all trying to we've got that kind of same, well, at least as all the libertarians, we've all got the same kind of general goal in a kind of low resolution way of speaking. And then I think even with there's areas where we agree, and those are worth discussing and exploring. But I think sometimes the areas where we disagree are even more important because I think we can help each other just as much with that as we kind of because we test our own principles, we test our own understanding, we refine our understanding of things. And yeah, I've not had a debate yet that's not been productive, at least in some sense. You know what I mean? So,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even if you just have a better understanding of the other person's argument, that's still a win.
yeah,
It's not, some closed-minded conclusion that they were fed. There, I would venture to say that the overwhelming majority of people hold positions that they don't understand themselves, why they hold those positions. This helps. This helps either reinforce or challenge positions that you hold and why you hold them, beyond just surface level. And then at the end of the day, if you still end up disagreeing, at least you both have a better understanding of each other. And hey, guess what? You don't have to hate each other at the end of the day. How novel is that? That's insane. Absolutely crazy.
yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, I mean, like I say, at the end of the day, even when we're coming together to debate, we're coming together on the same side of the fact that we both believe in freedom. We want to get there, and we know that the best way to get there is to understand it better. And the best way we can help each other with that is by discussing and debating, all the different elements of it. So yeah, no, I 100% agree. Okay, all right, we'll get into the meat of the issue. The kind of debate as I'm framing it is basically the death penalty and punishment in general. I'm kind of pro both. I think that both are allowed within libertarian principles, the non-aggression principle, and how we conceptualize rights. I know the death penalty in particular is something that's something that libertarians are. There's certain issues that libertarians are divided on, like abortion, IP, immigration, all sorts of things. And it's funny because I've read a lot of your work, and I recommend a lot of people do, and I'll put some links in the description so they can go ahead and do that. And it's funny because it's I've reading through all your articles, and I just found myself profusely agreeing, because I'm like, yeah, 100% spot on, like. And then I come to the punishment thing, and I'm like, oh, I don't think I agree with this. And that's really interesting, because and that's another reason why, as much as I open debates and discussions to anybody, not just libertarians, but the reason why I'm in particular keen to speak to libertarians is because when we're already agreed on so many fundamental points, those areas where we disagree become even more interesting, because it's like, oh, okay, so what are you seeing that I'm missing, and what am I missing that you're seeing? And as I say, I did read your article on the subject, which I'll also put in the link so people can check out. And I feel like I understand where you're coming from, but I want to obviously give you some pushback, give you some arguments, because even though I feel like I do understand the logic, I still have some disagreements, and obviously have a different position. So obviously I would have some disagreements on that. So I didn't know whether you wanted to kick straight off with kind of where you stand on it, or whether I should just flesh out my own position a little bit more. Where do you want to go with them?
Well, why don't we start with where you're at, and I'll kind of challenge that, and we'll kind of go from there.
Okay, yeah. Okay, well, as I mentioned to you in our previous discussion, and just to let anyone know who's listening, who's not familiar with my project, the Nations of Sanity project is based on the assertion that crime and law can and should be defined by the concept of individual self-ownership and established as the terms of a peace agreement. Basically, I'm saying the NAP should be the law. And I'm pretty sure that you kind of agree with that in regards to defining what we can and can't do, and when we can and can't use force. But I don't want, obviously, this is my attempt to steelman your position a little bit here. So obviously, correct me if there's any straw in here that I need to get rid of. But from what I understand, you agree with that from the point of view of prevention, because that is a direct, no question, protecting the right that we're all agreeing is a right. But you don't necessarily agree with applying force after the fact in what we would probably call characterize as a punishment, and that obviously would be connected to opposition to things like the death penalty as well. But obviously it would bleed into the general ethos of, is it right to punish somebody? Are you then violating their rights just as they once violated somebody else's rights? My opposition to that, just to kind of preempt and give you a little argument to kind of chew on, as well as explaining more your own position, is that rights function as with reciprocity. Like that's how they kind of must function, and part of the same ethos behind saying to somebody, look, you can't rape, murder, rob, and all these things, and we can and will and are justified in using force to stop you from doing those things. I don't see why our justification based on the violation of that reciprocity goes just because you've then committed the crime. I do understand where you're coming from, that the direct prevention of the crime is no longer in play. That's kind of done and dusted, and there's no kind of punishment that we can do that will fully undo that crime. So with regards to the idea of trying to restore some kind of reciprocity, or make the I think you used it, make them whole again, or make the victim whole again, or I can't remember exactly how you worded it, but you get my meaning with regards to, there's no way we can, particularly something like murder, but even anything like a robbery, even if you can kind of fully give them their money back, they've still gone through the robbery, and there's no scientific way that you could quantify additional compensation with regards to something like that as well. So it's just, you can't undo things that are done. You can only kind of apply what we would call justice. And I just feel that the same principle that defines crime objectively, I would argue, which is obviously the non-aggression principle based on individual self-ownership, I would say that would also define justifiable responses to those crimes. And one other thing, so I don't want to give you too much to chew on, but one other thing as well is I also feel like our right to protect ourselves would include going through with like the deterrent. You know, like it's one thing to say that I'll kill you if you try to kill me, but it's another thing to say, but if you succeed, you're kind of rewarded with amnesty almost. Like the deadly force that I would have been justified to use to stop you killing me, you're now free from that. It almost feels like a reward for committing the crime if you manage to, you know. So yeah, so I didn't mean to give you too much in one go there, but that's kind of where I'm coming from on it.
Right. So, I mean, you went through a lot,
Mm.
and you spoke about reciprocity, and I want a bit of clarification because that's a very specific word to use. With reciprocity, are you saying that because an aggressor violated the rights of another individual, that they should be treated in kind reciprocally, uh, and effectively giving up the right that they took from the individual that they harmed? Is that how I interpret your meaning there?
Yeah, I think that's a fair. Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah, I mean, I've said it before, so I'm pretty sure I agree with it. That the idea that yeah, you kind of lose the right that if you rob somebody else of a right, then you kind of lose that right yourself. I know it sounds a little bit like eye for an eye, um, and I would just add to that the little caveat that I wouldn't say that's prescriptive with regards to like you have to give them exactly what they've dished out. Like I do believe, like particularly the victim of a crime, and I think that discretion would be like the right over such discretion would be with the victims over anybody else. But I think the victims of the crime can kind of apply forgiveness with regards to you know what happens to somebody who's wronged them. You know, like they can, you know, even up to the point of full forgiveness. I think if you know if they are the victim, they can they would have that authority of forgiveness. But with at least with regards to what they would be allowed to do, I feel that yes, as long as it's proportional, and that kind of ties into my position on the death penalty, because there are obviously some crimes that where a lethal response would be proportionate, and I think that would also kind of bleed into the after the fact justification, like you know, response to those kind of
Right.
violations.
So I want to take I want to kind of take your we're starting with an aggressive act being committed. You know, we're operating in the assumption here in this discussion that guilt is really cut and dry as far as a knowledge of it, right? We're assuming that societally we know, Ted committed the crime. But in reality, we don't always know that. It's not always that cut and dry. We might think that it is a lot, particularly in this day and age, in this statist society that we live in, that we have the court of public opinion all the time, and all it takes is one headline and boom, guilt. And I'm going to throw Diddy out as a good example of this. And I'm not going to his defense. I do think that he's guilty, even though I've never seen any evidence. But this is wholly becoming from what's been reported in the news media, right? There is a chance that none of the allegations against him are true. I don't think that's the case. But on the flip side of that, we also have plenty of unsolved crimes that remain open and remain cold cases, and we have not identified who the prime suspect is publicly, or even if they even have a suspect. So whenever you speak about okay, how do we reciprocate that, you then unless I don't know, and forgive me, I don't know if you've thought this far out, but how do you go about determining whether or not somebody is guilty or not in using this type of peace agreement with the NAP as your central focus, right? It starts to get very, very complicated with how do you do that without arbitrarily infringing upon their rights, especially if we're supposed to operate under the presumption of innocence first, right? We don't put guilty people in jail, except we do. We do put, or I'm sorry, we don't put innocent people in jail, except we do. We put them in jail before they've ever been tried, and then they go through the trial.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I've just seen Patrick waiting, so I might just admit him so he can join if that's all right.
Oh, absolutely.
Sorry, bear with me one sec. Hi, Patrick. Hello.
What's up, gentlemen?
Hi, Patrick. How you doing?
Have you guys started yet?
We have, but we've only recently started, so you're welcome to join if you're up for it.
Well, first, my apologies for being tardy.
No problem, mate. No problem.
It's all your fault, Patrick.
Hey, man, it's unprofessional. Not good.
No, it's on. It's fine. It's on. I didn't know. I thought perhaps you'd forgot, so I just thought we'd kick off without you anyway, because obviously we're civil adults, so the moderator wasn't essential. But if you're here, we'd love to have you here and partake and help moderate things, because your contribution's always welcome. So,
what phase are you in? Have you done openings?
Yeah, we've basically done openings, and we've pretty much kind of literally just started the conversation, but we can kind of catch you up and then kind of restart, I think. Would you be cool with that, Derek?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, because we can kind of summarize. In fact, perhaps a good I'll just for Patrick's sake, I'll just kind of restate my position, and then I'll let you, because you were kind of responding to my things anyway.
For the viewers' sake, give me like the super short version.
Yeah, I will. Yeah. Well, okay. Well, basically, it's about the death penalty, but also punishment in general. I'm pro both. I believe punishment. I believe the death penalty is a valid thing within libertarian principles, and I believe that punishment in general is a valid thing. Derek, from my understanding, and obviously we're just about to flesh that out, doesn't he? Obviously, he does accept the idea that the non-aggression principle, can objectively define crime. Our right to protect self-ownership is a kind of before the fact thing. He doesn't necessarily agree with after the fact punishment, and obviously that would tie to opposing the death penalty as well. But I'm hoping that's a relatively decent steel man of his position. But if there's any straw in it, he can obviously sort of say now, and I'll kind of give it over to Derek to kind of sort of clarify.
And that. I mean, that's a good intro to what we already have established, and I was just rebutting that. I mean, do you want to kind of start over with including Patrick, or how do you want to go about this, or you just want to continue and then include him?
What do you reckon, Patrick? Do you want to kind of guide us from here, or do you?
No, I don't want to make the viewers pay for my tardiness. So just continue on, and I'll pick up the conversation as we go and make sure that my main concern is to advocate for the audience. So if I hear any terms not being defined, I'll ask for clarification, things like that. So.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. Okay, I'll tell you what then, Derek, if you don't mind. I'm sorry, I know I interrupted you, but if you want to just sort of carry on.
So
we'll
no problem at all. So what I was saying is that we throw innocent people in jail all the time, and we do that pre-trial as a means of ensuring that they go to trial in order to determine guilt or innocence. Well, in that whole aspect of it, we are victimizing them, especially if we're supposedly operating under the presumption of innocence, because they are not free. They are condemned. They have likely lost their job by this point. Even if the allegations against them are wholly false, their life is essentially ruined because of everything that has led up to the allegations being made public and then you bringing them in. So, whenever we have to think about these types of quote unquote systems, we have to think about the unintended consequences of them. And, you know, with your position being the way that it is, it still necessitates this type of system or something similar in order to essentially, you know, make it function. The take that I have is one that's entirely voluntary, right? You know, whenever somebody is accused of a crime that is kept very private and arbitrated between a private firm, they don't have to show up to their own defense. And if they don't, then, well, I guess the only objective result to come out of that private arbitration is that they are guilty because they didn't show up to defend themselves. After guilt, then it's all made public. So I assume that we could probably institute something like that with your vision in mind. But at the end of the day, you talk about punishment and reciprocating right violations to the aggressor. Well, to me, that transfers rights from rights into privileges. They're contingent upon good behavior, ethical behavior, non-aggressive behavior, so to speak. It's a caveat. It's a qualifier, but to me, that just having a qualifier means that they're not actually rights. And determining that can be subjective. I know we all agree that the NAP is kind of the guiding light here. But I mean, think about some of the things that are claimed today where we talk about speech being violence, when it's not. You know, it might hurt your feelings, but it's not violent. It's not aggressive. And, you know, if you have that type of mentality and apply it to the NAP, you can get a little wishy-washy with it. And so that's kind of where I take issue with a lot of what you're saying.
Fair enough. Yeah. I mean, there's a few things there. I would say that with regards to the kind of reciprocity issue, because I understand what you're saying about the rights privileges thing, but like the problem, for example, with the so-called rights that we get from our government and stuff like that, that is more like privileges because that's coming from their claimed right over us, which obviously we all agree is illegitimate, but that's still the kind of, you know, even in their sort of terms of rights, it's not really rights because it's privileges that they give and take away. So I understand where you're coming from by saying, well, if we're taking people's rights away in the sense of, you know, punishing them for a crime or whatever, even if we are sort of sticking with the kind of proportionality of the crime they're committing, then we are sort of taking their rights away. I mean, I don't want to lose the point in the language, but, you know, because I might sort of quibble as to whether we are taking their rights away. But if we, let's say we are, let's say, you know, like we're imprisoning them and we don't have the right to do that, or we're whatever the punishment I'm advocating for, depending on the crime. I mean, I do kind of hold the position that you lose the right that you deny somebody else. But because rights can only kind of really function in society in this reciprocal way, that it's almost, I mean, one of the reasons why I kind of present with my Nations of Sanity project is saying, let's make the NAP the terms of peace, because it's like those are the terms of peace between us. So if you break those terms, you've broken the peace. So I don't consider like the force used in response to a crime, because it's in response to a crime, it's like if somebody, sorry, I don't know, I'm trying to explain. If someone attacks somebody, say if someone punched somebody, we would say that's assault. Now, right. If someone fought back against the person who had attacked them, we wouldn't say the person who fought back was guilty of assault. We would kind of distinguish that between defensive and offensive force. And it's kind of the same thing with regards to these alleged rights violations with regards to what the criminals are suffering. It's like they've initiated the force, and as long as the response kind of is in relation to that, you know, we're not executing pickpocketers, let's say, for example, as they walk away with our wallet or something like that, you know, as long as there's some kind of as long as we can still tie it to our protection of our rights, and the idea that our rights as a universal concept, not just my rights, but our rights and your rights and all of our rights, can only function, you know, as part of this kind of reciprocal agreement.
Right.
Then once somebody violates that, I don't think it's fair to say that the response to that violation is the same crime. Like, the person who punches the person back isn't also guilty of assault. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of, or
right.
You know,
Well,
does that make sense?
the reason that is because aggression by definition is offensive. So if you're meeting aggression and defending yourself, it's not aggression, it's defensive violence. I think it's an important semantic to draw. Aggression is inherently offensive. So that's why you wouldn't say that somebody defending themselves against getting punched in the face and replying with that, in kind, is guilty of a NAP violation, because it's still non-aggression. It's violent, but it's non-aggression because the aggression was offensive.
Yeah, I got
if that makes sense.
Yep.
But we going back to this reciprocity kind of thing. I mean, you said, okay, yeah, we're not going to execute petty theft, right? Does that mean that the punishment for that should be you then steal from him the amount that was stolen plus the same amount from him to make him the victim of it? What's the appropriate punishment for that? Or, whenever you start to really think about punitive punishments, well, a lot of things, there's a lot of nuance that goes into a lot of these things. Like, did he steal that because he was hungry and he was starving to death and, he didn't have any means of paying for it? Or was he just a greedy person? Me, as somebody who's a juror, if I was sitting on a juror, I would see those two cases as completely different. Even though I would still admit, yeah, the person who stole, because he was starving, it's still theft. He didn't have a right to that. But, I would feel much more hesitant to punish him than somebody who was just trying to, gain for himself for no reason. Same thing whenever it goes to homicide. Did this person kill this person in cold blood? Or was it like a heat of the moment, impassioned, response to some other stimuli? I would view those as two completely different things. They both need to be punished, sure, using your system, but they can't be punished the same way because the nuance is going to be very different every time.
Sure.
Can I ask for both of you to clarify what sort of realm of society we're operating in? Are you guys having this debate centered around the NAP as sort of a bare metal principle? Like on the island, there's no society or culture or court system. We're just determining if the NAP justifies, let's say, after the fact attacking of NAP violators. Or are we talking about sort of a future modern Ancap society where there is insurance companies and defense or dispute resolution agencies? If you could both kind of talk about specifically where you want this debate to exist, because if it's the second one, I think you both should do some additional work to describe exactly how you would expect this court system to adjudicate crimes. And the last thing I'll suggest is that you pick a crime that is very severe, that that is more illustrative of the disagreement. Let's say like rape. So a guy rapes someone and then gets away. He's gone now. How should the system we're operating in deal with this person? Whoever wants to take that first.
That's a good question. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, but I think we're kind of both operating under just pure philosophical terms here. Not necessarily on the island, but just kind of hashing out which form would be better. Is that accurate?
Yeah, although you have obviously asked me about things like what would I do about, like burden of proof and the risk of punishing people that are innocent, and stuff
Right.
like that. So I'm happy to kind of play in both wheelhouses on that. But yeah, primarily we're obviously talking about the kind of right and wrong and what the NAP is allowing with regards to punishment. But I'm quite happy to also address the practicalities of, you know, a future voluntary society where this would have to be put into practice.
Well, let's go to Patrick. How would you like to steer this debate, since you're the moderator here?
I would like an example crime to be mock mediated. I want you guys to walk me through, maybe from both of your perspectives, how a rapist would be dealt with.
Okay. Well, I assume in our own ideal societies, correct?
Yeah, and just make sure and be clear about what level are we on the island, or are we in the city? Sort of, you know, are we in a future Ancap society with structure, or are we in an unstructured NAP bare metal situation?
Okay, Matt, I'll let you go first.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, as I say, I think that the NAP should be established as the terms of peace and based on the concept of individual self-ownership. Now, there's certain elements of our current criminal system. Obviously, there's a lot of things that are wrong with it, as you kind of alluded to, but there's certain things of it that I would keep, like, you know, innocent till proven guilty, the burden of proof being kind of like beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think both of those things are important for precisely the potential danger that you brought up, Derek, with regards to potentially, you know, violating people's rights in the sense of, you know, innocent people being wrongly punished and what have you. And I think that if we don't prosecute crime with a beyond a reasonable doubt approach, then we're guilty of, you know, kind of potentially violating their rights with criminal recklessness, because we're not even demanding a high standard of proof that they're even guilty. And obviously, if you're going to use aggression against somebody, or force against somebody rather, and you need to be sort of reasonably certain that it is, I mean, obviously this is within the worldview that you're allowed to punish people who are guilty of a crime. But what I'm saying is you need to obviously be reasonably certain that they are guilty. Otherwise, the force you use against them could make you guilty of a crime, because, you know, imprisoning an innocent person is obviously, you know, a crime, right, and rightly so. So that would be, and in my kind of hypothetical scenario, that would be the checks and balances with regards to things like that, because prosecutors would be responsible. There wouldn't be any of this prosecutorial immunity for prosecutors and immunity for judges and immunity for police. There'd be none of that. It would be, you know, people would be responsible for their actions. So if people, whether they've done it through conspiring or whether they did it through kind of criminal recklessness, if they ended up imprisoning an innocent man who was, you know, who they didn't have that beyond a reasonable doubt sort of certainty against, then they would be kind of guilty of imprisoning that man and whatever, you know, other associated rights violations go along with that. And they would be guilty of it because, you know, as I say, they acted criminally with criminal recklessness. The court systems, I'm sure we'd all agree, can be kind of a competitive thing with, you know, like private courts and stuff like that. My only kind of stipulation, which may vary from other Ancaps and libertarians, is that I do think that the NAP needs to be established as the law, so all private courts are at least operating on that same general hymn sheet. But the basic arbitration, you know, methods that, you know, most Ancaps kind of advocate for, I'm kind of down with. But the approach with regards to, you know, the law that they have to enforce is the NAP based on individual self-ownership, and the approach of things like guilty until proven innocent. Guilty. I got that wrong way around. Innocent until proven guilty. That's an important clarification. You know, and like I said, having the burden of proof being high with regards to dishing out punishment, which is obviously particularly important when dealing with capital punishment, because if you give someone the death penalty and they're innocent, you're basically guilty of killing an innocent person, which most people would consider murder. And as I say, and if you've done so in a reckless way, then all the more so. And that's one other point. So I just wanted to add to just to answer your question with regards to kind of mitigating circumstances in that, because, you know, a crime can still be a crime, but with sort of different degrees to it. You know what I mean? There is a difference between, it's not right either way, but like an aggravated murder as opposed to a cold-blooded murder, you know, that you might get a harsher punishment for the latter than you would for the former, but you'd still get a pretty harsh punishment for both because they're both, you know, they're both crimes. So, you know, there is still room for kind of leniency with regards to circumstance and stuff like that, and the amount of harm you're causing and the degree of duress you're under and all these other things. But the fact of the matter is a crime is a crime, and that's kind of objectively defined by this concept of individual self-ownership.
All right. Well, for
I'm sorry. Did you walk us through
I didn't do the rape thing
trial?
Sorry. Yeah, no, sorry, Patrick. Yeah, and I didn't. Okay, so I mean, as I kind of alluded to, if you found the rapist who you believe was guilty of it, you before you can actually give them any kind of punishment, you do need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they are guilty of that. Otherwise, as I say, you're potentially guilty of a crime yourself if you you know, dish out punishment to an innocent person, and the burden of proof. So they would go through some kind of trial. With regards to,
are they incarcerated during this process?
No. I don't think you could justify that until you, like I say, until you meet that burden of proof. I think you would have to withhold anything remotely resembling a punishment. Perhaps if you had a high level of proof, and before it had gone through perhaps all of the rigors and testing of like having people kind of oppose it, there maybe would be an argument if you, but you would perhaps be liable for damages if you were wrong to hold them, when, you know, if like, so no, I mean, I would say I'm tempted to say no. Until you've actually proven their guilt, you wouldn't have the right to use the force against them. And if you did, if there was such a system where you could, or you did, you would be liable for damages against them if it turned out they were innocent, because you've imprisoned an innocent person for however long beforehand. Is that
okay? So they're not incarcerated during the investigation and trial. Go ahead and finish your story before I interrupted you. What happens next?
Well,
let's say they're found guilty.
Well, if they're found guilty, then the punishment, now with regards to proportional punishment, it's not an exact science. So what I would say is we would have a kind of range, and I would say that the discretion of that range would be ultimately, like, the victim would have the highest right to have discretionary authority within that range. So, for example, let's just say for a rape, let's just say we can. The sentence could be anything from, say, 10 years in prison up to life in prison, up to, say, the death penalty. If the victim of the crime wanted to lessen the sentence, then they obviously can do that. They don't have to give them the maximum. But if the maximum, if they want to give them the maximum, then they can. Like basically what I'm saying is there's probably a minimum and a maximum of each kind of crime as to what you could give. Like I say, I don't think anything other than rape and murder would warrant the death penalty, but I think both of those would. So I think you could go up to and including the death penalty for those crimes, but that would be at the victim's discretion.
Okay. I have a question for that. You know, what if a victim is like, oh no, none of that works for me. I want full genital mutilation. I mean, who determines what is and is not allowed?
Well, I mean, I think what we've got to, that's why I say it's not an exact science, but I think we've got to kind of try to keep some kind of proportionality with the crime. Genital mutilation. I mean, to be honest, I think you can make a case for that with a rapist. Perhaps castration, at least. You know what I mean? It's like, I mean, Yeah,
they did bad things with their toys. Take their toys away.
Well, this is it. Yeah, I mean, I mean, I'm pretty. I think to better answer that question, I'd almost have to use an example of a lesser crime where the maximum punish, because to be honest, I do kind of consider rape and murder to be the top two, so the maximum punishments would apply to both. So it's hard to imagine a scenario where the victim wants worse than what she's allowed to give. You know what I mean? I suppose perhaps, like, we couldn't just let her torture them forever or something like that. You know what I mean? So there would be a limit. There would be a line where we can say, but this is the thing as well, because the reason why it's not an exact science, but the reason why, and I've got this common theme with my project about drawing a line in the sand, like the whole establish the Napper's law, but people have differing interpretations over exactly what the NAP applies to, and I say, okay, but we've got to draw a line in the sand where we say, oh no, this is definitely violating the NAP and we're going to enforce that. And if there's a gray area, we can take a different approach with regards to, well, that's a kind of slightly different thing, but actually no, it's not a slightly different thing, because one of the things I say with the gray areas, we take a different approach, as in we still let self-ownership kind of decide who has authority within those gray areas. And with regards to, well, where we've got a gray area with regards to like the appropriate punishment to give somebody, I would say that the authority to work within that gray area and decide where we land within that gray area would be with the victim, because they have that kind of higher right to make that decision. But we still have to kind of draw a line in the sand, which is our limit of tolerance over differing interpretations, where we say, okay, now at this point you've stepped beyond the proportionality. And although it's hard to give an example when using rape because it's such a severe crime, but let's bring it down to petty theft or something, and then and they want to, and they say, well, I want obviously everything back plus the same again or something like that. That might be sort of within that gray area realm. But if they say, oh, I want them executed, it's like, well, no, that's beyond the line in the sand. I mean, that's an extreme example, but I just wanted to kind of illustrate the point I'm making with regards to, we can draw a line in the sand and say, now you're definitely stepping outside of it. And it's the kind of same approach I advocate for with regards to how we apply the NAP in general. It's like, because there are people say, well, there are differing interpretations and there are gray areas over things like age of consent and stuff like that. And it's like, well, yes, but we can still draw a line in the sand where it's no longer a gray area and say, okay, at this point we have that beyond a reasonable doubt. It's almost applying the same beyond a reasonable doubt approach that we do to determining someone's guilt as we do to determining whether something even is a crime in the first place, and also determining whether a proportionate response to a crime with regards to the punishment is also proportionate. It's applying that same kind of ethos of, okay, well, I'm only going to stop you executing a petty theft because I can say beyond a reasonable doubt that that's not a proportionate response, but I can't make that same claim if that person murdered somebody or raped them, in which case, even if I thought that you'd be better to do a lesser punishment, or if I had a better idea of how to treat criminals, that's all well and good. But if I'm not the victim of those crimes, it wouldn't be my decision to make. And they could go up to that line that we draw, as long as they don't go past it.
All right. You want me to take mine or?
Yeah, it's your turn.
Okay. So I'd paint my ideal society as fully anarcho-capitalist, and to me it doesn't really matter if it's in a large metropolitan area or on the island, as you say. Within a large city like Houston, you have microcultures that by and large the city has one large culture, but as you go into different areas, there are some significant differences in how they how they handle certain things and how they view certain things. And by and large, they're not significant, but whenever to that culture they are, to that microculture that they are. So to me, it doesn't really matter. If somebody has been raped, the first thing that they're going to do is contact whoever their security firm is, and make the case. They'd launch their investigation. Certainly in the case of a rape, you already have who you're accusing. more often than not. Sometimes you don't. And it would be up to the investigatory team to determine that in those cases. If a clear-cut accusation is made, then they'll reach out to that person. He'll have to contact his security team to do essentially a counter investigation to prove his innocence, because they would have a fiduciary duty to do so, assuming he's going to fight it. If he just up and leaves, then there's no defense to be made, and the only assumption that can be concluded in any arbitration firm is that he's guilty because he didn't show up to his own defense. He's not required to be there under any circumstances. But like I said, if he doesn't, then, well, the conclusion is guilt. After the trial, they'd go to the private arbitration, who would hear the case, and they would be structured however the free market demands, whether that be a voluntary jury, or if the arbitrators have a panel and they are the ones to make the determination, or however they want to handle it, because they are subject to free market pressures, and they cannot they can't be biased. They can't afford to be biased. They have to make sure that everything that they rule on is airtight, so to speak, because if they get it wrong, then their own reputation goes down the drain. So it behooves them to make sure that these arbitration trials are carried out as impartial and as fair as humanly possible. After the trial, if a not guilty verdict is reached, however that may come about, and let's say for a fact that he is guilty, but they couldn't prove the case. I mean, you can only prove what you can prove, and unfortunately, sometimes things like that will happen. Anarchy is not going to prevent those things from happening, and just like they don't prevent those things from happening even in our most statist society of today. On the other hand, if a verdict of guilty is rendered down, at that point, this is one of infinite possibilities, but the way that I view it is that all of the circumstances of the case, all of the details are publicly released. John Smith was found guilty of raping Jane Doe, and here are the facts of the case. Here are all of the arguments that were made. Here is the transcript of the arguments that were made. Any evidence that they wish to release, or the victim wishes to release, to kind of hammer it home, this person did this to me, is made public. That person's reputation is severely tarnished for the rest of their life. Society can completely ostracize them to the point where they have to self-exile. And Matt might find some favor in this type of solution. If the culture feels like paying back a rapist with feeding him into a wood chipper is a satisfactory form of judgment, then they'll do that themselves, and there will be nobody to press charges against them, because the culture has determined that punishment for that crime is acceptable. Nobody will bring that case to the arbitrator because they feel like there's no crime committed here. On the other hand, they could have a strict rule against that, and if somebody even tried it, then guess what? They are now getting put through the same ringer as the rapist did, in a completely different set of circumstances, in a completely different trial. And if guilty is rendered, then the level of ostracism might be different, but that reputation will still be tarnished in some way. Up to and including, and the severity of that really depends on the details of the crime. It's essentially, a simple way of putting it is that you're leaving it up to the free market to decide. And, depending on how severe the crime is, that person their only option would be to go to some remote forest somewhere, self-isolate in complete solitude for the rest of their lives, because nobody will ever associate with them. I recently had a conversation with somebody on X who proposed that in such a society, you could actually put kind of put your reputation on the blockchain and secure it that way, which would help protect you against like false accusations and things like that. Which honestly, I think that if we dedicated people to actually coming up with those sorts of things would be really beneficial, especially in this technological day and age. But even assuming that they can't, in any anarchist society, your reputation is everything. It's your most valuable asset. And if you do anything to screw it up, well, there goes your livelihood. Nobody's going to want to employ you. Nobody's going to want to do business with you. Banks will close your account, assuming they still exist, and they'll just give you all your money back. They're like, we don't want to do business with you. We don't want your money. Nobody will associate with you. Nobody will trade with you. And the only thing that you really have to look forward to is a nice isolated life, assuming you don't unalive yourself in the process. So, it's clean. It's everybody's rights are respected. Nobody's rights are taken advantage of, except in the case of the culture that does want to feed a rapist into a wood chipper. I'm not saying they don't deserve it. I'm not saying that I wouldn't agree with it, depending on the circumstances. But philosophically, I cannot say that that is viable because of the fact that it objectively violates their rights. And but even then, if the culture says that it's fine, it's fine. So other than that type of cultural acceptance, nobody's rights are violated and the guilty are still punished. So that's kind of an overview of how my type of system, quote unquote, would function.
I think you both now have to connect the dots between what are rights and how do you gain or lose them. Because one of you said that, the response to this rape situation can be up to and including death. And the other one said the most you can do is just ostracize this person. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ancap Air. That's basically what I heard, is that ostracization is the maximal crime justifiable by the NAP.
I would say, to be philosophically consistent, that would be applied to any crime, including first-degree murder, premeditated murder.
And your justification was that they still maintain rights after committing the crime. Okay, so that's why I say I think we need to connect these dots between what is the source of our rights, what's the ontology of rights, where do they come from, how do we maintain them, how do we lose them. Whoever wants to take that first, but I think both of you should take a crack at that, because that's really what this debate comes down to, I think.
Did you want
Matt, I'll let you go first.
Okay,
I'll let you go first.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is, rights as a concept, because it's not just I've got right or you've got right. It's we all have rights. It's individual rights as a universal concept. So that necessitates the reciprocity that I mentioned earlier with regards to how rights function in the world. You can have your right of self-ownership, but if you're the only one who's got the right of self-ownership and everyone else is being denied theirs, then that's not self-ownership as a universal principle. That's just you enjoying, and that's when it does become sort of almost like privileges. So for me, that's why the kind of reciprocity aspect of the rights is so vital to it, because it's kind of it's basically how rights, it's kind of the only way rights can actually exist and function in the world is part of reciprocal agreements. I mean, that's kind of why I have my whole Nations of Sanity idea of saying, let's make a peace agreement, because it's the only right that we can justifiably use force. It's the right, this the concept of this right is what tells us that when we can justifiably use force, because we're basically saying, like, you don't have the right to, say, rape somebody or murder somebody or whatever, so we can use force to stop you. And I know, and I just want to add a little bit of steel into the steel man of Ancap's position. I just want to clarify, Derek does also agree that we can use force to stop the rights violation, as in before the fact. It's just that after the fact, I just want to make sure that that stillman is complete with regards to Derek's position. It's not that he's saying that we can't use force, period, and we just got to let people attack us and all we can do is say naughty boy afterwards. He is saying that we can use force beforehand if we can prevent the crime, but if they commit the crime and we failed in our attempts to use force to prevent them, then our kind of window is shut with regards to when we can use force. And I'm saying that it's not, because I'm saying that the force we use isn't a rights violation because they've already broken the reciprocity inherent in the concept of rights as we kind of understand it, as this universal concept that everybody has. And one other kind of thing I just want to add to that, which is kind of one of my biggest concerns with Derek's position, is, ostracism's all well and good, but we can apply that to everything. It doesn't just have to be crimes and rights violations. We can ostracize anyone who behaves in a way that we disagree with for whatever subjective reason. But the whole point of the non-aggression principle and the concept of individual self-ownership and establishing where our rights end and where our freedom ends is to really, and again, why I call it like the terms of peace, is because it's defining when our use of force to stop people is justified. And so that's the difference with ostracism there. And as I say, and I know you agree with me with regards to before the fact, with regards to actually preventing the crime. And like I say, I do think I follow your logic on that, because you're saying, well, that's a direct protection of the right, so it's kind of nice and clear cut, whereas afterwards it's too late, you can't protect the right, so the force isn't used for that. But it is still, with regards to the reciprocity side of it, it's like the force you use in response to the violation isn't the aggression, and the non-aggression principle is the non-aggression principle. It's not the non-fight back principle. And I know what you're advocating for isn't exactly the same as pacifism. The only difference between what you're talking about and actual pacifism is the fact that, unlike a pacifist, you are at least allowing force beforehand to kind of try to prevent the violation. But the problem is, by allowing no force after the fact, it almost feels like a reward for managing to commit the crime. It's like, I'll use force to stop you, but if you succeed, you almost get rewarded with this kind of amnesty from any force that you would have been liable for, if that makes sense. I hope that answers the kind of question.
Let me just repeat that back to make sure, for the audience's sake, that we're clear. So the ontology of rights for you is reciprocal agreement, meaning two people basically agreeing to afford each other certain privileges or respect. Let me know if I'm paraphrasing this correctly for you. And when that reciprocal agreement is violated or broken, rights sort of cease to exist for that violator, such that it allows for punishments that we talked about for rape, for example, up to and including, castration or death. Is that a summary of your position?
Yeah, it's close enough. Just to kind of fine tune it a little bit, I would say I'd say that basically, because of that reciprocity, they're the ones that are causing the rights violation. And even if you wanted to call the force used against them in response a rights violation, which I wouldn't, but I don't want to quibble over language, but even if someone did want to say that, I'd say, yeah, but that's still caused by them, because they initiated the violation of the reciprocity with which which is the only way these rights can function as a universal concept. Like the reciprocity, they depend on that to function as a universal, like I say, not just me owning myself, but everybody owning themselves. Then that's why the reciprocity is kind of inbuilt into the definition. It's not just my personal privilege that I have right over myself and no one else has it. It's this universal concept of individual rights that everyone has right over themselves. And there's a kind of implicit the reciprocity is implicit within that definition. Does that make sense?
Well, my opinion doesn't make any difference here. So,
well, no,
Derek, same question to you, Derek. What's the ontology of rights? How do they function? How do they exist? and what happens to them over the course of an aggression like rape.
Right. So rights are inherent to everybody, and I think we're all kind of in agreement on that. I have, in my first book, I drew how parallels to the animal kingdom and how they do exercise some of what we consider to be the basic tenets of natural rights: life, liberty, and property. Where you have every animal will fight to defend its own life if it's feasible to do so. So that would be an exercise of the right to life. You can't say that animals don't have liberty. They go wherever they want. They do what they want. So they definitely exercise that right as well. And many species are territorial, and that territorial nature is effectively the right of property ownership. And so I think that it is beyond just human beings. I think it's inherent to every living thing on the planet. And how we deal with transgressions against those is really an ethical question. I recently wrote a piece that I entitled "The Theory of Natural Ethics," where really every ethical question boils down to one thing, and that's consent. Does the person consent to what's being done to them? But I also talk about something that I call ethical neutrality. And what makes something ethically neutral is where you find the root cause of where that ethical responsibility lies. So, in the case of an assault or on a rape, that person is being violated. Their consent is being violated. So, the act of raping them is unethical under that framework. But if they were to fight back, the fighting back is not unethical. It's actually ethically neutral, because the ethical responsibility of the entire situation lays at the feet of the aggressor, or the rapist in this case. So he was guilty of the ethical violation by violating that individual's consent. Now, once that whole situation is over and done with, if the victim were to then retaliate, after a day or whatever, outside of that incident, well, that person then becomes the aggressor and violates that person's consent. And so they are effectively committing another unethical act on their own. And so you have this situation where a victim is making the aggressor the victim as a retaliation. And that's where we get into this I that's where we get into this: who determines what punishment fits the crime, right? In the heat of that incident, well, the ethical violation's already taken place. The responsible party is the aggressor. But once the aggression is over with, you can't claim self-defense anymore, because then it's retaliatory. It's a retaliatory aggression, and is therefore, as we determined earlier, inherently offensive, no longer defensive, which makes it an ethical violation. So I hope that kind of clears things up from my perspective, but I'll be happy to answer any questions that might stem from that.
Okay, so let me just do the same thing and summarize. So for you, rights are just inherent in all sort of living things, well, at least creatures, not all living things, because you didn't mention plants. So right. Maybe all motive creatures, let's say. And when one of these creatures commits some sort of crime or ethical violation, I hate using the term crime because it pulls in this whole notion of a legal system. So when they violate the NAP, basically, I guess saying it strongly would be precisely nothing changes about their inherent rights. They still possess them, and if they escape the situation, then it's almost as if nothing has changed from their rights perspective. I'm not trying to state this in a bad sounding way, but I'm just trying to summarize it in as few sentences as possible. Was that fair? I mean, take a moment. If I wasn't fair to you, please take a moment to.
No, it's fair. Recoup. I think the wording is a little off. It's fair ultimately what you said, but rights are not subject to surrender, revocation, or suspension in any way. That's what differentiates rights from privileges. So yes, because somebody has committed an unethical act, even something as heinous as rape or murder, they still retain their own rights, even though they violated somebody else's.
Okay, and specifically to the ontology, just to make sure the audience is clear, where I think you basically said that they're inherent to, you know, life, to living creatures, let's say, and maybe you can give me that language from in your words better. But I guess my clarifying question is why? Says who? Where do they come from? Like what? How do they actually exist? Where, if they're inherent, how can we detect them?
So I use the animal kingdom as evidence to support the claim that rights are natural. We're essentially going into like a Hume's guillotine type scenario, that just because it doesn't mean that it ought to be. But I really hate Hume for that very reason. Uh, but that's why I use it as supporting evidence. I could be completely wrong, but the fact that we see our natural, the things that human beings have determined to be natural rights of life, liberty, and property being exercised in the animal kingdom gives supporting evidence to the fact that they are natural, and it is the way, and it ought to be that way as well.
Okay, I think I've done
I
my
know
job.
that's kind of a non-answer.
I've laid the battlefield, so I think both of your positions are very clear now to the audience. So I'm going to shut up and let you guys discuss. Matthew, why don't you lead off?
Well, one of the things I wanted to touch on was like when you talk about like consent, because that for me ties back to the reciprocity issue. Because, and again, I don't want to mischaracterize what you were saying, but from what I heard you say, or in my mind, how I interpreted it is when you were saying about like rights depend on consent. It's all about consent. I mean, and I agree with that. Like, you know, obviously, if I have right over myself, then my interactions with you require my consent, and you own yourself, it requires your consent, and all the rest of it. But this is also kind of, there's a kind of implicit consent that exists with regards to these kind of reciprocal agreements of the right of individual self-ownership, because it's not like everybody who's not signed a contract not to rape me is a potential aggressor. You know, they have to actually commit an aggression. It's not just the fact that they haven't agreed ahead of time that they're not going to. Obviously I can't assume ill intent, and all of these things. But if they actually did commit that crime against me, then in addition to the fact that I do still hold the view that just like where you said about how rights aren't suspended, if they're inalienable, they're always kind of there. But even in your position, correct me if I'm wrong, but even in your position, they are briefly suspended before the fact with regards to the force you're allowing to be used against them before the fact. But it's just as soon as when it's after the fact, they're not. Or is that only because, I don't want to misrepresent you, or is that only because before the fact, the force you're using is a kind of direct prevention of the rights violation? So it's not a rights violation because it's preventing a rights violation. Would that be your position?
So if you think about root cause of the situation, right? The root cause is the aggressive act, is the aggressive, unethical act. And while you're certainly not going to get your aggressor's consent to retaliate, that's what it makes it ethically neutral on the part of the victim. But because the ultimate root cause of the unethical act lays at the feet at the unethical aggressor. So they're allowed to take whatever action they feel necessary to defend themselves from that act, because they have the right to defend their consent violation, right? I hope that answers your question. I feel like I'm missing something.
Yeah, no, it does. It does.
It
does. I just wanted to clarify that, because the problem I'm having is because I do fully agree with that, but I don't understand why that then ceases to be the case once they've committed the crime, other than I'm not going to pretend there's no distinction, because I do understand that at least the force you're using before they commit the crime, you know, isn't just with regards to breaking this consensual reciprocity and all the rest of it. It is actually to prevent the crime from happening. So you've got that added legitimacy to it. But the other part of it that makes it legitimate, that you just described, with regards to they're the ones who have, they're the root of the infraction, if you like. They're the ones who've caused it. They're the aggressors. That's why I agree with that, but that seems to follow on. Like, I don't see a reason why that no longer is the case once they've committed the crime. It's almost like successfully committing the crime gives them the reward of no longer having that what's the word for it? Like that where the way in which they've opened themselves up to this force that can be used against them, which they're responsible for. They can't call it a rights violation because they created it. What I'm saying is why does that stop once they've successfully committed the crime? Like, it's almost as if we're rewarding them for committing the crime by taking away the consequences that up until they successfully committed the crime, they'd opened up to themselves. Does that make sense?
I think I understand what you're asking. You're asking why the right to retaliate, why it's no longer ethically neutral once the act's been committed, correct? Okay.
Yes, yeah.
So let me illustrate it with a little anecdote. Let's say you're walking down the street and you see off in the distance, you see somebody grab a little old lady's purse and start taking off. He's running your direction. Well, you're carrying, right? So you pull out your gun and he sees you, stops, throws his hands up.
Well, Derek's not carrying. He's not in the United States of freedom.
Hypothetical. Okay. But so now he stops and throws his hands up. Do you have the right to shoot him in the face at that point?
No.
Why not? Under your framework, the logic dictates that you would still have the right to shoot him in the face, even though he has stopped, because he was the root cause of the theft that just occurred, right?
I get what you're saying, but I tell you where the difference is. And if I could just ever so slightly change the example just to help illustrate my position a little bit better. Imagine it's a home invasion. And because I've had this argument with people before where they've kind of disputed whether you're allowed to kill a home invader. And I obviously say, of course you can. And you probably say that you can as well, because it's a before the fact force. But the reason why you can kill a home invader before the fact, but you can't execute someone who you later found out robbed your house, is because the reason why you can kill the home invader isn't because that's a proportionate response to the crime of them robbing your house, which is why you can't then use that lethal force as a punishment. You know, like after the fact, you found out they robbed your house, you catch them later. Because the reason why you can kill the home invader is not because that's a proportionate response to the robbery. It's because of the other threats that they're posing to you. They've invaded your home. There's a potential lethal threat. So you can, and it's a similar kind of thing with the example you gave, but it's just, I just wanted to illustrate it a bit more clearer with the home invasion example. But it's kind of similar to the mugging example. Whilst the person is mugging them, it's not the fact that stealing the wallet or whatever it is that they're trying to do deserves to be killed. It's the fact that struggle that they're in, that the person has a right to resist. And then if they are escalating the force where, you know, to win the resistance, you know, it results in the person using lethal force in that struggle. But whereas after, so what I'm saying is after the fact, what is a proportionate response is determined by the actual crime that's committed. Whereas during the act, what is a justifiable response isn't just the crime that's being for sure committed, but also all the other things that are being threatened in that situation. You know, so like once the person's made off with her purse and you, like say, you point the gun at them, they put their hands up, that you've got no reason. you've got no reason to kill them anymore. Whereas before that happened, you had a reason to kill them that wasn't just a proportionate response to the violation of robbing a wallet, but it was in response to the heightened threat of additional violations that do warrant potential lethal force, because you do have that right.
Right. I think you're kind of proving my point here, is that once things are no longer escalated or at risk of escalating, then you no longer have the right to use deadly force or force against them, which is my entire point. I mean, even using your home invasion sign or scenario, obviously somebody who is breaking your home means to do ill will to you. They've already started trespassing. They're planning on robbing you, and if that escalates, they could end up killing you. But if you walk in, let's say it's in the middle of the night, you wake up, you hear them, you grab your gun, you walk out, they see you, and they immediately stop, throw their hands up. Well, they're still trespassing, but clearly it's no longer escalating anymore because they're surrendering. But if they continue to do what they're or even try and fight you, well, then that's a different story, because, as I would say, the unethical act still rests there. But if they stop, throw their hands up, even though they're still trespassing, at that point, ethically, you should give them a chance to vacate and leave all your stuff. But if their hands are up and you shoot them in the face, ethically, I'm saying that you were guilty of murder. Would you disagree with that?
Well, no, but the reason is not quite the same as the one you're laying out for me, because what I'm saying is I'm not saying that I get what you're saying, like saying, well, that's why I'm saying we can't punish them after the fact, because the justification for the force we were going to use no longer exists. But what I'm saying is the justification does still exist for the proportionate response for that crime. So if you're going to act after the crime, you know what the crime is committed, and you can, pick your response within that kind of proportionality field. But what I'm saying is whilst the crime is still in play, there are other crimes being threatened, which is why you have. So like with the home invasion thing, it's like I say, if it was an after the fact robbery, like you found out from your CCTV camera that you got robbed while you weren't there, doesn't mean you can't punish them after the fact. They owe you, they still owe you the damages, but and you can use force against them, but the force you can use against them is now proportionate to the crime that they've definitely committed, and they don't no longer pose any additional threats. So like with the home invasion, you're not killing them because that's the proportionate response to theft. You're killing them because they're threatening all these other things where the proportionate response is. So that's what I'm saying. It's like the danger that gave you the right to go to that higher level of actually killing them might no longer be there. But that doesn't mean that your right to punish them at all has disappeared. It just means that it has to actually be in relation to the crime they've committed, and not all the other things that they were potentially threatening. Like I say, once they've burgled your house, they're gone. So all the reasons why you had to potentially kill them because they're invading your house, and they could be trying to kill you for all you know, and they're the ones that have created that aggression, and you know what I mean. So that's all on them if you shot them dead. But if after the fact they robbed your house and all they'd done was, say, property damage, for example, then the reason why you can't kill them is not because of the threat no longer being there, but because you're acting out of proportion for the actual crime you've committed, and there's no other threat to justify why you would kill them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think we're in agreement on this, even if we have some semantic differences. But I think we're in agreement on this. But I guess my question is, if you agree that you can't use aggression once the threat of escalation is no longer present, how do you justify punishing somebody and infringing upon their rights, via incarceration or what have you? Assuming they still have their rights, or I guess you would agree that they no longer have the right to do those things.
Do what thing? Sorry.
Well, I guess live freely for a period of time.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I mean, I do kind of go along, and I'd be interested to see, like, how and why you disagree with this. But I do kind of go by the ethos that you lose because of this kind of reciprocal status of rights and how they function. You do lose the rights you take from other people. But that's why I say about the fact that you can't execute somebody who burgled your house earlier in the day. You can't give them a lethal punishment because they don't deserve to lose that right because they didn't rob that right from you. But the reason why you could kill them during the home invasion is because they might be trying, there's at least the threat of that, and that they've invaded your home and you have the right to defend yourself. So, it's because of that. So the right, because the thing is I feel, and obviously there's overlaps because we're both libertarians, but there's big overlaps also with regards to where we see justification for force. We both agree that, like, the aggressor has opened the window for justifiable force against them because they've initiated the violation at the root. I agree with that, but I just don't see how that stops once they've committed the crime. Other than, and I do concede, I don't want to, like I said, I do concede the one difference is obviously they're no longer, the force being used is no longer in direct, is being used to directly prevent the crime being committed or the violation, because it's now after the fact. So it is too late to kind of prevent the crime, but the violation of reciprocity is still there. The violation of consent is still there. The terms of peace, to obviously use my whole kind of idea of how it should be, has been broken. You know what I mean? So it's like, although I know as libertarians we don't agree with war because of all the innocent people being killed, but it's a little bit like, forget the innocent people for a moment, and you've just got, say, one military base of fully complicit people and another military base of fully complicit people, and one of those military bases fires a bomb at its enemy a missile at its enemy base. We would both agree that the other one is justified in either firing a bomb just before they let their bomb off to prevent it from coming over, or to hit it midway through, or whatever, use force up to do it. But it's almost like, but once the bomb's landed and it's done, and we missed our opportunity to save ourselves, we're not allowed to fire back. And if we do, it's like a violation to the same degree. And the reason why I don't agree with that is, at least to my mind, using the same ethos that you laid out for justifying the before the fact use of force, with regards to the fact that they've initiated the aggression, they've initiated the force, like the non-aggression principle, not the non-response, not the non-retaliatory principle. So that's kind of how I see it with regards to how rights exist and function, and who has violated that kind of consensual relationship. Like, as you said yourself, it's about consent. They violated the consent of this implied reciprocal agreement, and therefore the force that is used as a response is something that they're the ones of guilty of initiating it, just the same as they were before they committed the crime, which I think we're on the same page as. But I feel like it's still the same after they've committed the crime. I don't see an obvious reason why that's no longer true. I do understand that we're no longer protecting our rights, so to speak, in regards to it's too late to commit the crime, prevent the crime once the crime's been committed. But with regards to the fact that they've initiated the violation and opened up themselves to the justifiable force, that seems to be on them. And to take the other approach of saying, well, once they've committed the crime, it's too late now, we can't do anything force-wise. I know you've got your other solutions, but talking about like the justifiable use of force, well, the problem with that is essentially, to my mind, rewarding the successful completion of the crime. You know what I mean? It's like, we'll use everything we can to stop you committing this crime, but once you've committed it, you're going to be rewarded by the fact that
we can't use force against you.
We can't use force against you. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to labor that point. But yeah.
No, you're fine. You said something, and it's the second time that you said it, so I want to go back to it. You talk about this implied consent, this implied agreement, I would like for you to elaborate on that, because I have thoughts on it.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, it's a little bit like with I'll use my Nations of Sanity project example as a perfect example for that. I've had libertarians, tell me they think it's a stupid idea. They would never sign my agreement and all the rest of it. And one of the objections I had was, well, what makes your agreement, the NAP's valid regardless of your agreement? What makes that so special? And I'm just kind of like, well, yeah, it's just about establishing it and all the rest of it. But my point is in my hypothetical Nations of Sanity society, I can't go around imprisoning everybody that doesn't sign my peace agreement. You know what I mean? Just because they haven't explicitly agreed to it doesn't mean that they're aggressing. Until they violate it, there is this implicit, like it's basically like the peace between us is implied until I know from you that it's violated, if you know what I mean, or it's like I'm not going to assume you're a murderer, a rapist, a thief, and all these things until you show me that you are. And once you do that, then I can use the appropriate force against you. As I say, still within some realm of proportionality to whatever threat you pose. If you're a thief, I'm not going to execute you, but if you're a murderer, I feel like I'm justified in doing that. But you have to commit one of those crimes to establish that you are one of those things and violate that reciprocity. So sorry, did I answer your question? I feel like I
kind of. I take it, the reason that I ask it is I take issue with the notion of implied consent, as a principle. Now, we do operate under implied consent all the time, just as a convenience of making things move along. And I would venture to say that probably all of those interactions, if you were to get explicit consent, they would explicitly consent to whatever those are, right? But the reason that I take issue with implied consent is that implied consent is immediately defeated by explicit dissent.
Yes.
And so you run a huge risk of ethical violations if you're operating under an ethos of implied consent. Because just because they're not speaking out against it doesn't mean that they actually don't consent to it. And with my ethical framework being all about consent, that it objectively creates an unethical situation. Even if they don't complain about it, internally they find themselves what we would say is living under tyranny, because they haven't explicitly consented to it. And that's why I lay out in my ethical framework that there are actually 4 pillars of consent that need to be met in order for everybody to know whether consent is actually being fulfilled. The first is that it must be voluntary, meaning that you can't like point a gun at somebody's head and say consent to this, and that being, legitimate, right? It must be explicit, meaning saying, yeah, we do operate under implied consent a lot under very trivial things, because if it amounts to nothing and it wouldn't be a huge deal for them to be like, hey, whoa, hang on, no, I don't consent to that. Instead of mandating, hey, can I do this beforehand? But even still, it must be explicit for us to know that they consent. It must be informed, meaning that you can't leave out key details of what they're actually consenting to and expect that consent to be valid. And then another thing is consent must be revocable. Like, just because I consent initially doesn't mean that I'm going to consent. I'm going to continue to consent to it 10 minutes from now. Because even if you gave me all the information, I could say, oh, you know what, that sounds good. And then I consent and I consent and I consent. And then I'm like, whoa, hang on. Okay, I didn't actually anticipate this, and it's not working out to how I want. Now, in a written agreement, we would have severability, which we would consent to, and I would be responsible for upholding my end of those should I sever the contract. But the fact that I have the right to sever the contract must be there, right? That is inherent right. The same reason that.
Sorry to interrupt. I just want to make sure that this is related to the topic of the debate, which is, does the NAP allow for after the fact punishment or things like the death penalty? So if we're on a tangent, maybe we save that for another chat.
No, I do have a point.
Okay, good.
Yeah. So, but because of this consensual framework, uh, if we're going to punish people, well, you're doing that against their consent, and and correct me if I'm wrong, but you're using this implied consent as a justification for saying, well, they agreed to this. Am I wrong in
No,
that line of thinking?
yeah, no, that's not the context with which I was using implied consent. What I was meaning is um like but basically what I meant was like how I'm assuming like like in my hypothetical Nations of Sanity world where I'm having my peace agreement, for various reasons it might be useful for lots of people to explicitly consent to these terms of peace, so we can all know that we understand what freedom means and what self-ownership is, and we're all on the same page. But what I'm saying is the only people I'm justified in using, like force against, are people that actually violate those terms of peace, not the ones that just refuse to agree to it, refuse to consent to be part of the agreement or whatever. So it's like there's a kind of there's an implied reciprocity, or there's an implied consent to the reciprocity of individual self-ownership. It's a little bit, I mean, perhaps there's a more complicated way of saying it's almost like the innocent until proven guilty kind of approach with regards to everybody around me. I'm not going to assume everybody wants to murder and rape me and assault me and all these things just because they haven't given me their explicit consent to this peace agreement. So that's what I'm sort of saying about like the terms of peace would be implied until somebody demonstrates to you that they are violating that kind of implied consent, if you like, because what I'm saying is it's not an agreement that everybody's explicitly agreed to. And I do agree that obviously implied consent goes away immediately when you've got explicit dissent or explicit consent that override, but we often use implied consent with things like, but I mean, or put it another way of explaining it might be good is to say, like, if I went on a safari and I was looking at the lions in Africa, I'm not going to assume for a second that they would even be able to particularly well conceptualize and understand, the principle of reciprocal rights and stuff like that. But they are also not aggressing against me. They are just, there's a peace between us. You know what I mean? It's like it might not be there if I got out of the Jeep that I'm in and walked over to them or something like that. But again, because I know that they don't really have the ability to understand the terms of peace I might have in mind. And if they did, they probably may not care anyway, because they may just see me as food, but it's like, but I've seen like wildlife programs where a bunch of lions have gone down to the water with full bellies, and zebras will see they got full bellies and like, yeah, they're not they're not a threat to us and what have you. So it's like I wouldn't and just for the same reason I wouldn't use force against like a mentally handicapped person or a young child who I knew couldn't understand reciprocal rights, or at least assumed that they couldn't, because that doesn't mean I can then assume that they are aggressors. You know what I mean? What I'm saying is there's an implied consent to reciprocity among all peaceful people, even if it's not there explicitly. I don't know that they're explicitly peaceful people, but they are peaceful people, as in they've not explicitly told me that they're not. So there's a kind of implied peace between us. Does that make sense? I hope I'm making sense.
Yeah, no, I think I understand what you're saying. The question that I have though is, whenever it comes to distributing punitive punishment for crimes, um, for one, I guess, how do you fund all that? And for two, who assumes the station of executioner? Like, who has that? Who who has the right to take another person's life via execution, even if they they've committed a heinous act, like, first degree murder? Who has that right to assume that station, and
Um,
why?
Well, I'd say potentially anybody. I don't think that's something. I mean, for example, if you saw, and I know this isn't exactly the same, but I will tie it back to that. But like, for example, if you saw it's not just the fact that you have the right to use lethal force against somebody who was, say, threatening you with a deadly weapon or whatever. You'd also have the right to use that force to defend somebody else who was being attacked by somebody. So and because I obviously carry that same right, obviously, of defending yourself before the fact with regards to punitive actions after the fact, it's the same with regards to who has the right to do it as well. Because often, like a victim for whatever reason might not be able to defend herself, and a victim for whatever reason may not have the means to, say, punish a criminal, whatever. She can't afford her own little security firm or NAP enforcement or whatever it is, and somebody else wants to do that on her behalf. Like the thing with the NAP as law is, I say that everybody has the right to enforce it equally. No one has the obligation. With regards to how it's paid for and who would do the executing if we were to administer capital punishment, there's multiple potential answers to that, and I'd be happy to have a conversation where we go into more detail and all the best ways to go about that. But there's not a hard and fast answer to that, because it could be, pretty much anyone who's willing to do it would have the right to do it, because it's not about me having the right to kill, it's about you losing the right to not be killed. And whoever carries out the punishment that we say, we're assuming you're the guilty person now. So it's not about I've got the right to kill all of a sudden, I've got my kill someone for free card. It's more about the fact that you've lost the right to not be killed by the fact that you say you murdered or raped somebody or whatever. So once we've determined that that is a justifiable punishment for you, who carries out the punishment doesn't really matter, nor does how we fund it, as long as it's obviously not funded immorally through like taxation or something like that. But there's all sorts of different ways in which obviously private arbitrations and stuff like that, and the desire for justice to be served is something that people are incentivized to pay for. So there's all sorts of different ways we can do it from a practical point of view, and I don't want to get off topic by going into the details of that, but also because it doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is if it's determined, whatever the punishment is, who has the right to give you that punishment, it's like, well, anybody really. I mean, if there was a kind of competition over people who wanted to, for example, like say, oh, this, like this person wants to give them punishment or that wants to give them punishment, and there's some kind of, contention there, then you would have to look at who has the higher claim. And as I said before, victims of a crime have the highest claim with regards to anything that's kind of disputed, whether it's like the gray area of what's the correct punitive response, or whether it's who dishes out the punishment and stuff like that. Again, as long as you're not stepping over outside of that line in the sand that we established earlier, then yeah. Sorry, I know I didn't answer, but that's why I couldn't answer, because there's not an answer.
Well, and I that's kind of my point, is because even though you say that it's not about, oh, I get a free pass to kill somebody, that's effectively what you're doing with this system, is that you are, whoever is chosen by whatever methodology you choose an executioner, you are putting that person in a station superior to the individual, specifically the individual about to be executed, because you are granting him privilege to take that person's life, even though he's currently not an aggressor. So it could be argued that the act of executing him is an aggressive act, because it's definitely not defensive, which leaves that it has to be offensive, which means that by definition it is aggression to commit an act of execution to somebody who is not an active threat to anybody.
Well, it's not directly defensive. It's not directly defensive in that specific case, but it is kind of generally defensive in the way, just to harken back quickly to that example I used of the two enemy military bases that are firing rockets after each other, where the one rocket has already landed, so the other rocket that's being sent is just pure response. It's pure, you could call it vengeance if you like, or whatever. It's after the fact. It's too late for them to save themselves, but that rocket is still defensive in the respect that they have that right of response. They have that right of defense, and their right of defense doesn't go away just because the person has successfully committed the crime against them. Even though, and I don't want to preempt your response, but even though you can say, well, yeah, but what are they defending now because they've already failed to defend themselves?
I mean, if I may, this sounds kind of like you're contradicting what we spoke about earlier whenever it comes to somebody surrendering during the commission of a crime. It sounds like you're trying to now justify that, yes, you can use force against them in that type of scenario because, you know, of this continuation of defense, however you want to phrase it. And logically, if you're going to support something like capital punishment and execution, then why couldn't you also support shooting somebody in the face who has immediately surrendered during the commission of a crime, and that threat is no longer that threat of escalation is no longer there? It's the same scenario. In fact, it's probably more justifiable. I'm not saying that it is. I wouldn't agree that it is, but it's probably, you could probably argue it better in the case of immediately at the commission of the crime versus later when the person is completely stripped of any means of self-defense. They're immobilized more than likely, and then they are just waiting for their own death. And it seems to fly in the face about the points earlier. So how do you reconcile that?
Well, the reason why I don't think it does contradict that is because I'm still maintaining the force that you're like, because the reason why you can't shoot the guy who surrendered in the face, you know, who was robbing the wallet or what, that's the one you're on about me contradicting, isn't it? The one
Well,
where,
I mean, yeah, but you could change the scenario of this person just murdered somebody else and then they immediately surrender. What gives you the right? What gives the right to execute them at a completely later date versus executing them on the spot immediately after if they've surrendered?
well, just I'll address that one as example as well. But just to go back to the previous example, the reason why you couldn't execute the petty thief after he surrendered and the threat was no longer there, because all of those threats that might have warranted lethal force are no longer there, and executing them is not a proportionate response to the crime that they have committed. So even if you called it defense of that crime in a kind of general sense that you have this right of response, like returning missiles onto the army base that missiled you, it's still got to be proportionate to the crime that you've been a victim of. So the reason why that's a little bit different when you change it to the murder example, it's like, well, okay then, but the reason why you can still execute them afterwards isn't because of the danger that they're posing at the time that's justifying the lethal force. It's because the lethal force is now proportionate to the crime that they have already committed. So they've already done that violation. They've already like the way in which they've caused that violation and opened up that force against them. There's two parts. Like before the crime is done, like in the process of mugging you or robbing your house or whatever, when it's home invasion, you've got two justifications for the force you can use. You've got the justification of your proportionate response, which you can use to, you know, to defend your rights. And then you've also got the justification of the additional threats that they're posing as a home invader. Now, what I'm saying is like, in the home invasion example, the force that you're justified whilst they're home invading and presenting all these other threats, that's a much higher level of force that you're justified in using than the force that you can use as a proportionate response to the crime that they're actually committing. Which is why after the fact, when these threats and stuff are no longer there, that justifiable force you no longer have, because that justifiable force was based on all these additional threats that they posed. But the justifiable force that you could use at the time that's related to the proportionality of the crime that they're committing, that you still can use, because the threats may have gone that gave you that higher level of things, force that you can use, but the crime that they've committed, not only has it not gone, but it's been confirmed. It's actually been committed against you. So their threat to you has been confirmed by the committing of that one crime, and you can use force, in proportion to that, but it has to be in proportion to that crime, not just all the other threats that you thought that they might have represented at the time, because those threats are no longer in play. So like the home invader, the person who burgled your house earlier the day is guilty of that crime, and he's warranted that level of force. Does that make sense? Sorry, I know I don't want to.
Yeah,
sorry,
Matt,
let me jump in here.
Yeah,
sorry, let me jump in here. We have 7 minutes remaining until our hard stop time. At least what was sent to me when. Are we still hard stopping in 7 minutes at the 2 hour mark, or are we extending? And we need everyone's explicit consent.
I'm happy to go longer if Derek is, but I don't want to be too taking the mick with his time with regards to. Also, we don't want to go around in circles. You know what I mean? So.
Right. I'm also good to continue on as long as the conversation's moving forward. What about you, Patrick?
Oh yeah, I'm good. You want to do another 20 minutes?
Yeah, that works for me.
Okay, I don't want to limit you guys. I want to facilitate. So okay, we have explicit consent.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
So our remaining time is precious. I would ask that everybody sort of really focus in on what the core points of disagreement are. I think a lot of the time we've been talking about sort of the entailments of the core positions on the ontology of what rights are and how that folds out into reality. But maybe if the disagreement about what rights are is what is being debated, then maybe the point of the debate is determined by that. Go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, no, that's valid. And I had written this down to kind of discuss it a bit later. But I used to be a supporter of capital punishment. This was back in my statist days, but when I was kind of libertarian-ish. And I'll tell you exactly what changed my mind. It was because I was a gun rights advocate, which seems counterintuitive. But my whole thing as being a gun rights absolutist was that, the government didn't give me the right to bear arms, therefore they don't have the right to take it away. Well, applying that logic to capital punishment has to be also applied, because the government didn't give me life. Therefore, the government doesn't have the right to take my life away from me. And in a libertarian, minarchist, or even anarchist society, I would say that philosophically, society did not give you the right to live. Therefore, society cannot take away your right to live. And that goes to any of your rights. Your rights were not granted by society. Therefore, society can't take those rights away. And that's why that's ultimately what drove me to being an anarcho-capitalist and having this idea having the ideas of ostracism resonate with me, because of the fact that they still punish the guilty without violating their rights and without taking away their rights, and being guilty of the same types of crimes that criminals are guilty of. And so I asked the question earlier, what gives who executes somebody in your society, Matt? Because that's an awesome power. That is such a godlike power to have. Even if you say, it's not a free pass to just kill somebody, it's just an execution of the you no longer have the right to live. Even if you spin it like that what's happening is you are giving somebody a free pass to murder somebody.
Fair point, but I would say that is also true even in your worldview before the fact. Like if you happen upon a crime in action that warrants lethal force, then even though it's very brief, you are being given that right to kill that person in that situation.
May I rebut that,
yes,
or do you want to make?
No.
Do you want to finish your point?
No, correct if that's incorrect.
Yeah. So I plainly state in my book that even using self-defense does violate their rights, because you have, if you kill somebody in self-defense, you have violated their right to live. It's justified because of the fact that they are the aggressor. It's justified under the laws of nature. It's justified under, any ethical theory of, consent that I've laid out. It is still, you did take away their right to live, but in such a situation, it's either them or you. Only during that situation. You can't do it after the fact, because at that point you're now becoming the aggressor. You're no longer, it's no longer an active situation where you're defending yourself or somebody else from having their rights violated. I will concede that point any day of the week. But the fact is that they started the initial unethical action. Ethical responsibility lays at their feet, and so ethical responsibility for their own demise ultimately rests at their feet because they were the aggressor. But once the aggression is over, ethical responsibility falls at your feet.
That's the leap I can't make with you. That's the bit where I struggle. Like I'm agreeing with you up until you then say once the aggression is over, because like when you say about having the right to take this person's rights away, my point is it's not society or us or whoever's doing it, private courts or whatever, the victims advocates or whatever. It's not us that's taking their rights away. It's them, for the same reason that you laid out with the before the fact justification, that they've created the violation. So it's like, I mean, even in when I read your article that touched on this, that, like explained the fact that obviously before the fact you're defending your right, but then after the fact you're no longer doing that. And I do accept that distinction. But even in that article, when you were describing our rights in the first place, you were saying about, and this isn't word for word, but I'm trusting that this is a stillman gist of what you said. But basically, our rights over ourselves means that we have the right to do what we want with ourselves, as long as we are not violating that same right in others. So because our rights depend inherently on that reciprocity, if you violate that reciprocity, then the rights violation that comes upon you as a result of that is your doing. It's not society's or the victims or the people who've responded. It's you. And you seem to agree with that point before the fact, but not after the fact. And I'm saying that I don't feel like, even though I do accept that after the fact, the whole trying to prevent the crime is no longer in play because it's after the fact and the crime's already done. But everything else you've said with regards to who initiated this breakdown of the rights, this breakdown of this consent, the breakdown of the reciprocity, I know I keep using that word, but that's for me, that's such a key part of how rights exist as a universal concept, that we all have these rights, not just you or not just me or whatever. So that's what I'm saying about I mean, I know it sounds like we're kind of spinning the same thing differently, using different words, obviously, to favor our perspective, but perhaps that's useful to kind of help each other understand the perspective we're coming from, because I get what you're saying about, like the after the fact difference, but what I'm saying is with regards to saying, well, you're violating this person's right if you execute them with the death penalty or whatever punishment you're giving them. And I'm saying, well, no, because if it's a proportional response to the violation that they've committed, then they've initiated, like they've created, they took their own rights away, basically, by violating the equivalent rights of another person. And my biggest fear with your approach, for all of as much as I understand the benefit of ostracism in other areas with regards to how we want to shape society, When it comes to NAP violations, that's when we can use force. And I feel by hamstringing people that they can only use force before the fact and not allowing them to use proportionate response force after the fact, it's essentially rewarding criminals for successfully committing the crime by like the thing that's acting as a deterrent, the fact that like to a murderer or a rapist or whatever, that the fact that lethal force could be used to stop them, that deterrent disappears immediately as soon as they've successfully committed the crime, because that force that we were saying was justified to stop them is now no longer justified, even if we're playing the proportionality game. So that's kind of my concern with it, and that's why I don't see it as us violating people's rights, because they've initiated it. Does that make sense?
Okay. So, well, it does, except for the thing that I'm having trouble connecting is that,
go ahead and give this answer that you're giving, but at the end, I want to ask you both to do something. So at the end of what you're about to say and respond to, I would like you to tell us what it would take from Matthew to change your mind, Derek, and bring you closer to or all the way to his position. And then when Matthew responds, when Derek, I'm getting names mixed up. When Matt responds, have him do the same thing in the other direction. What would it take to change your mind? And then I'd like to give you both an opportunity to address or attempt to do the thing that might change the other person's mind.
Yeah. So just real quick, the thing that I'm having trouble connecting is that you talk about use of force after the fact, but there's this gray area after the fact where force is not allowed. That I can't make that connection. We talked about it ad nauseum with the home invader scenario. And I know that you talked about, proportion of the crime, but if that crime were changed to a murder that somebody actually witnessed, like there's no doubt whatsoever that this person just murdered that person and then they surrender, you've also conceded that, you don't have the right to shoot them in the face at that point. So there's an after the fact gray area where force is not allowed. And I can't make that connection as to what makes after the fact force allowed versus not allowed, and who determines that.
Well, I think you've misunderstood my position a little bit there, because I wouldn't, if you changed it to, like, the reason why I said you couldn't shoot in the face the purse snatcher who surrendered was
because it's not proportional.
Because it's not proportionate. But I'm not saying that you can't necessarily shoot the murderer who surrendered. There would be a risk to that, to yourself, with regards to, like, if you don't let it go through kind of a process of proving their guilt beyond a reasonable doubt and all the rest of it, you might be playing a little bit of a game of risk that you might have killed an innocent person, or or whatever. So it might behoove you not to execute someone who's surrendering, even if you do feel like they're the ones who could who done it. But I would say that if someone committed a murder and then somebody else killed the person who committed the murder, I don't think the person who killed the person who committed the murder is guilty of murder.
Even if so, A kills B.
Yeah.
C witnesses A kill B.
Yeah.
B surrenders when he sees, or I'm sorry, A surrenders when he sees C.
Yeah.
And C then kills A.
Yeah.
You say that that's absolutely justified.
Yeah, I would say it is.
Okay. That's the disconnect that I was not picking up. And so, I appreciate the clarity. I do want to go to Patrick's question on what could convince me. And this is actually a very difficult question to answer, because I feel like your position is a bit of a regression in my philosophical journey. And I don't mean that to sound insulting.
No,
I know
no,
it does sound insulting. So I apologize, because I don't know how else to say it. But really what you would need to convince me is that rights are subject to forfeiture, and how that different, and have a damn good answer as to how that's different from just a regular privilege. Because while the you know, the criterion might be a bit different as far as its extremity. Like, okay, yeah, your privilege of staying at my house goes away the second that you piss me off, is superfluous compared to the, you know, you no longer have the right to live if you kill somebody. But philosophically and fundamentally, you'd need to make the connection as to why that actually is acceptable, and why that is still different.
All right, he's painted the target for you, Matthew. Why don't you take a shot at the target and then paint your own target for Derek?
Yeah. Okay. Well, the reason why, cause I get the point with the rights and privileges thing, because I do kind of agree with that line of thought when we're talking about, you know, government granting us so-called rights, and actually they're really just privileges because it's being granted to us by somebody else and it's being taken away from us by somebody else arbitrarily. The reason why I don't feel this works the same when with this particular conversation is because it's not, your rights are inalienable. The only person who can forfeit your rights is you. And that's exactly what you do when you violate other people's equal rights. So, like, just like how we define our right over ourselves as, you know, basically being able to do what you want as long as you don't violate others. So, our right is dependent on us respecting other people's exact same rights. So, I mean, maybe there's something wrong with the way I'm conceptualizing it, but that's why I don't. To my mind, there's no contradiction there with regards to saying yes, the rights are inalienable and they're not privileges like they would be if, like, you know, like the rights that the governments give us and can take away and all the rest of it, because in this case, it's not that somebody else is just taking our rights away from us or just giving us our rights. Our rights are inalienable. We already have them, but we can forfeit them. Now, we can obviously, you know, give them up in some kind of voluntary way where I can, you know, say I want to consent to be in a boxing match, and then you've got the right to punch me because then it's all consensual and all that. So I'm not giving up my rights in that sense. But if I start attacking you, then even though that's not like the same kind of consent, I've also forfeited my rights in the sense that I'm no longer like so that's just, I mean, there might be a way, you know, you might think that there's a problem in how I'm conceptualizing that, but that's my justification in my head is it's not, they're not privileges that people can just take away. The only person who can forfeit your rights is you. But when you violate the reciprocal state, I always have trouble saying that word, the reciprocal state of rights, when you're the one who violates that, when you initiate that destruction of that consensual relationship, then you're the one who's forfeited your rights. So that's why I still think rights are still rights and not privileges, just because you can quote unquote lose them when you commit a crime, because you're the one who's lost them. No one's taken them away from you. You forfeited them. Does
okay, a quick question to that. You know, whenever we talk about these sorts of things, we're always talking about two of the three. We're always talking about life in the terms of capital punishment and liberty in the terms of incarceration. Am I able to give up or surrender my right to own property generally? Because the same logic should still apply across the board.
How do you mean? Can you just sort of elaborate?
Well, like certainly you would say that, okay, if I stole $100 from you, you know, you could make a case for, I owe you the $100 I stole plus $100 from my own self. Okay, I cannot follow the logic there, but is there any way that I could surrender, commit a crime to where I can wholly not own property anymore?
I can't think of one off the top of my head. No, I mean, unless you were saying that the crime you committed was so great with regards to the damages that you owed that, for all intents and purposes, you're never able to pay it off. You know, so you're never able to own property in that way. But there's no, you wouldn't.
Well, the question was intended to be difficult to answer.
Yeah.
And it's purely illustrative, just to show that, okay, if I have the ability to give up rights with my actions, then okay, committing a murder, I give up my right to life. Committing robbery, I give up my right to liberty. What commissions can I make? What acts can I commit to give up my right to property? And if the logic doesn't trend the whole way, my thought is that you can't really say that the first two actually have any standing.
Well, I mean, I don't know if I'm misunderstanding you here, but you would only be giving up your right to property in relation to, like, so for example, where you said about if you robbed £100 of somebody or dollars, and you could say, okay, well, let's say the proportionate response could include up to your £100 back plus like another 100, because that's what
right. But we talk about giving up rights wholly. He gave up his right to life whenever he committed murder. He gave up his right to liberty whenever he committed, his fifth intoxicated manslaughter, right? We're not going to execute him, but he's not going to be free anymore, right? So you can give up, quote unquote, give up whole rights, except for the right to property. And I find that fascinating that, we can't drive a conclusion to that third one. And I would say that logically, you would have to be able to do all three.
Yeah, cool.
I don't want to open up a whole nother discussion on it, because it's kind of outside of the scope, but that's kind of my rebut to that. So
fair enough. I just quickly, just to kind of address it a little bit, I would say that, like, because I just want to clarify that I'm getting you right with what you're saying, but with the example of you robbed the £100, which means we can take the £100 back and take another £100 from you because so what I'm saying is you lost the right to your £100 because you took somebody else's £100 kind of thing. So your loss of you're not losing your right to property in general.
No, just that little bit.
Yeah, right? It's still proportionate to the right that you've taken. But the reason why we could take someone's whole life, if that's what they've taken from somebody else, is because that's still that proportionate section, even though it is the whole life. It's a little bit like, if let's imagine £200 was all the money you had in the world, including the 100 you've stolen and the other 100 back. That's all your property. It doesn't mean you're banned from ever owning property again. It just means that the recompense covers all the property you own. And in the case of taking somebody's life, you've only got one life to give. Perhaps if you were a cat and had 9 lives or something, you could pay for it with one life or something. I mean, I'm being a bit facetious, but you get the point I'm making. I'm not sure I agree that you can't lose the right to property, but it is still focused on the proportionality of the right that you're denying. But if you take someone's life, then you're open to losing the same back. Like if you take £100 from someone, you're open to losing £100. Sorry, I didn't mean to labor the point.
No, you're fine.
Well, why don't you give us the what would change your mind, Matt?
Okay. I think what would change my mind, the biggest problem I have is this disconnect between, like, I'm with Derek on the we both seem to be in agreement that the initiation of the force you use, in defensive force before the crime is committed, to prevent the crime, that force is totally, the responsibility of that initiation is totally with the person who's committing the crime. So you're not considered to be aggressing against somebody, but then after the fact you are. And my argument is obviously that they've still initiated that crime, and we can't reward them for successfully committing the crime by removing the consequences that were alive. So I suppose what I need from Derek to kind of move me over to his position is to explain or help me understand, perhaps, what is it like. I don't want to mischaracterize. Don't
phrase it as a question. State what would change your mind.
Okay. What would change my mind is if Derek can show me how the how I'm wrong to say that because I'm making the point that only you can give up your rights, only you can forfeit your rights, and I'm saying that when you violate somebody else's rights, you are forfeiting your equivalent rights. So the force that's used against you, whether it's before or after the fact with relation to the crime you're committing, is on you. Like, you're the one who's initiated that. So what I would need from Derek to move me closer to his position, or towards agreeing with him, is to see how that's not the case, and to see how we're not just essentially rewarding criminals for the successful completion of their crime by taking away all forceful punishments, including, severe things that were in play before they committed the crime as a justifiable way to stop the crime from happening. But it seems like a reward system for successful completion of a crime, and it seems to me that it denies people the right to defend themselves. So can you say that people still have the right to defend themselves? So I don't mean to make it as a question. Yeah. But if I can still feel that, if you can convince me that people's right to protect themselves isn't being violated by the fact that we're not allowing them to use force once the crime against them has been successfully committed.
Right. So I understand why you would phrase it as a reward system, but I don't agree with it, obviously, because there are still consequences to those actions, severe consequences. Even if we stick to the philosophically principled position of ostracism, to that essentially the culture and quote unquote, I guess for lack of a better phrase, the free market would determine to be proportional to the details of the crime that was committed. Whether that be, okay, I did a little bit of fraud, but it wasn't like sinister. Okay, far less people are going to engage in business with you, but there are still some that might take the higher risk. Versus cold-blooded murder, where nobody's going to associate with you, and you have to essentially get up and leave. Your entire life is over in that part. So it's not a reward system. It's about protecting everybody's rights, including the rights of the guilty. And it's so easy for us to scream from the rooftops that, oh, they're guilty, so therefore they shouldn't have rights. And I view that personally as a means of dehumanization of our fellow person. And those types of things can be used to justify very heinous evils in the world, and have been used in the past by dehumanizing our fellow person, even those who are actually guilty of horrible things. They're not incapable of change, and they still retain their rights. Now, we might disagree on that, but there is a universally objective truth one way or the other. Or there's a third, and nobody actually has rights, and nihilism is actually the objective truth to the universe. We don't know. We're philosophers in this regard. But my feeling on this would be, if rights do exist, and they are inherent to us as human beings, then we should err on the side of respecting them across the board out of fear of universally violating them, than take the chance on, making people feel better by violating people's rights, when objectively and universally, outside of our ability to know 100% factually, that we are actually committing ethical violations and violations of individual rights. I think that we should always err on the side of individual rights, even when it's hard, and especially when it's hard.
I understand that, and to be honest, I do appreciate and understand your concern with regards to kind of, having a justification for removing rights in a kind of general sense. But I do feel like the reason why I don't feel like that's a danger in the same way that you do, though I do recognize it's a danger worth worrying about. So I think you're right to have it as a concern. But the reason why I don't think it is a concern with what I'm advocating for, or I feel like I'm guarding against it, is to clarify that we're not saying that once you violate rights, you lose rights, like as an overall general thing. We're saying you lose the rights that you violate. So for me, that's what keeps it from going into that kind of privileges territory, because it's you that's forfeiting your rights, not other people arbitrarily taking them or exerting some authority to take your rights. It's based on your actions. And this fear that I would share with you with regards to any kind of system that we were trying to create about not allowing people to use, like, the fact that you've violated a right to take all your rights away from you, I would say that it always has to be in proportion to the rights that you've taken. And I say, as long as we follow that rule, then we can say that no one else is arbitrarily taking your rights away from you. You're the one that is forfeiting specific rights related to the rights that you're denying on other people. And I think as long as we stick to that rule of proportionality in relation to the rights that you're violating, and obviously it does depend on, I suppose you could argue that it's spinning the same thing different ways, but I do feel like the more accurate description of it is to, rather than saying other people are violating your rights because you violated rights, I'm saying you're forfeiting those specific rights in relation to what you're violating. But as long as it's in relation to what you're violating, I don't think we're going to step into that dangerous territory that you're concerned about.
Okay.
All right. Is it time for closings? Shall we?
I think so. I think we've probably had a good exploration of each other's position, and yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So let's do our closings by stating what degree, if any, your position or thoughts on this topic have changed. Let's list any resources that you'd like the audience to read to maybe dive into this topic further and learn more about the fundamentals that you guys are basing your positions on. And yeah, go ahead and give your wrap ups. You want to start, Derek?
Sure. My position is always about, ensuring that individual rights are respected across the board. I write a lot about this topic in various different forms in various nuances. On my Twitter account, under my articles tab, there are a bunch of different articles. The most recent one that I've published is called The Theory of Natural Ethics, which I brought up a little bit here. But one that Matthew was kind of referring to throughout our discussion was one called Justice and Anarchy, and kind of lays out a fundamental foundation of how justice works without an actual legal system or justice system in a statist ideal or box, if you will. That's really where I point everything to. And it really boils down to, again, respecting rights. And the only way to truly know that you're respecting rights is based on their individual consent, in my opinion. And that's why I'm so steadfast in my position in this, is that at the end of the day, if you're executing somebody, it's against their consent. And yeah, they might have factually committed a heinous crime that violated the consent of somebody else, but their consent still matters. Their rights still matter, just as all of ours rights still matter and objectively do so. So
My turn.
Yep.
I understand Derek's position a lot better. I did take the time to read that article that he mentioned, which gave me a decent idea of where he was coming from. And I would recommend that people listening to this, whichever side of this debate you kind of agree more with, or even if you have a totally different position, I would recommend that people check out that article. I mean, I recommend all of Derek's work, but that article in particular, obviously in context to this discussion, because when I first came across Derek's work and spoke to him as well, I found myself like in very strong agreement on so many issues. And when I came across this one area, my first instinct was, well, that's ridiculous. Like, that's crazy. And it was only by reading his article and obviously having this discussion with him more that, although I still disagree with it, I don't consider it crazy. I understand the logic he's using. I understand the things that I feel like I do anyway, understand the things that he's afraid of by going the routes that I'm advocating for. And although I did understand some of that, like I said, I do recommend people check out the article, because he does obviously lay out the difference between, you know, protecting a right with it before the fact force that you're going to use to defend, and then the after the fact force that's more akin to kind of like a revenge or something like that. So I already got that, but one of the things that I think has really kind of illuminated in this discussion is the concern about, once we start wielding the power of punishment. I mean, like when Derek mentioned he's worried about giving someone the power to kill when it comes to kind of dishing out capital punishment. Now, although I do insist that I don't think these things are, because we're not giving people the power to do these things, we're just saying, like, you know, if someone deserves to be killed, then they deserve to be killed, and who does that is kind of beside the point. And it's not like we're empowering anyone some special right to murder. And I would kind of obviously stick by my assertion that, you know, punching someone back who's punched you isn't assault. Their attack on you was assault. And in a similar kind of vein, I don't view us as violating somebody's rights when they are the ones who've initiated the rights violation. And from my point of view, it is them that's forfeited the right. But one of the things that I've really gotten out of this, I've got a lot of things out of this conversation, but one of the things I really appreciate about this conversation is it's helped kind of emphasize the importance of that element to me, because I can understand why Derek's worried about saying, oh, well, just because someone's done something wrong, now their rights have disappeared. And that's, you know, and removing people's rights is a dangerous game to play. But my kind of sort of rebuttal to that, and the why I'm not concerned, why I understand Derek's fear, the reason why I don't share his fear in this regard is because I don't think it is a case of taking people's rights away from each other. I think it's a case of people forfeiting their own rights, and that's what keeps the rights inalienable in my mind, and keeps them from being something as arbitrary as privileges. That some, you know, because with privileges someone else could just take them away for no reason, and they grant them to you in the first place, whereas with the rights that self-ownership that we're talking about, me and Derek both agree that these rights are inalienable. They don't depend on somebody else granting them to you like privileges. So I do understand Derek's concern that if we allow them to be taken away, doesn't that make them too much like privileges? But my point, or my point to that point, is that it's not that we're allowing them to be taken away. It's that the person who has that right is forfeiting them when he violates the reciprocal nature of them by, you know, violating somebody else's rights. And I think as long as we make sure that our responses are sticking to that kind of rule, so that we're not just saying all gloves are off once you commit any kind of minor rights infraction, as long as we keep the proportionality, and as long as we keep it to the point that it's the aggressor that's forfeiting their own rights, I don't think that we're guilty of the contradictions that that Derek fears. But I do appreciate and understand why he fears that, because I do think it's very important that we don't play fast and loose with regards to taking people's rights away. And when we're talking about justifiable force, it does have to be hard and fast to the non-aggression principle. But as I said before, it is the non-aggression principle, not the non-retaliation principle, or a kind of quasi-pacifist principle, which I'm not, don't mean to strawman Derek, because I know he's not advocating for pacifism, but my problem is what he is advocating for is only different from pacifism before the crime is committed with regards to, and once afterwards, it's essentially the same as pacifism. And while we do have ostracism as a handy little tool, for me, that's a tool for things that outside of the non-aggression principle, like we don't like someone because he's racist, we ostracize them. We don't like someone because we think they're not a nice person, we ostracize them. But if they're rapists, murderers, and thieves, we can use force. And ostracism seems too much of an impotent response that I would be worried would be tantamount to almost what's the word? Almost sanctioning crimes. Because I do know that obviously Derek's not intending to reward criminals by successfully completing a crime with this little prize of no, you're not going to get any force against you. But whether that is the ethos behind it or not, I fully accept that it's obviously not. But for all intents and purposes, that is the kind of result of what's happening. There is this kind of intrinsic reward for successfully committing the crime, where the force that was previously justified to be used against you has now completely disappeared. Not just dropped down to the proportional response of your crime, as opposed to what other force could be warranted, you know, for the threats and stuff, other things that are in play, but to the point where no force, to the point that we can only do what we could do to a racist or someone we didn't like with regards to ostracism. And yeah, so that's my kind of final thoughts. That's my kind of concern. But I think it's been a really, really great debate. I really appreciate. It's been a good faith debate. Everybody here, we're all liberty lovers. We're all on the same page in that regard, and that's why we really want to challenge each other on these little areas, because I think we all benefit from that. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I want to basically echo that last sentiment. What we've done here is what debate should actually be all the time. There was no debate bro tactics. There was no rhetoric attempting to win, you know, the hashtag win to make the other person look bad. This is the good work. This is what we all need to be doing in the liberty space to continue refining our ideas. And so I want to thank both of you for being at the intellectual and mental growth level of being able to do that. I would like to make a book recommendation, and this is kind of out of left field, but it definitely covers this topic very well, in my opinion. Stefan Molyneux wrote a book called Practical Anarchy back in the day, back when he was doing good work. I obviously don't endorse many of his positions other than this, but in this book, he actually does an amazingly good job of actually detailing out how a free society might possibly work with DROs and insurance companies and bonding. And, you know, let's say you're the victim of a crime and you want to make an accusation and enact, you know, or hire some sort of justice company to help you figure out what happened, or to, you know, adjudicate the dispute with your attacker, how you might have to post bond that would cover any externalities if it turns out the person you're accusing is innocent, and how you might need an insurance company to back you up on that to cover these externalities that go on. Anyway, so he did an actual in-depth, detailed job of how this might actually work, and I think it's good reading.
What's that book called again?
Author aside, it's called Practical Anarchy. Let me see, what's Practical Anarchy: The Freedom of the Future by Stefan Molyneux. I think it's a free PDF download on his website, freedomain.com. Yeah. So you might put a link to that in the description. I think it's a worthy read for this topic. I have been Patrick Smith. You can find me on Twitter @NotGovernor. Thank you, gentlemen. Any last words?
I just wanted to thank you, Patrick, for your time and for moderating. I know that you were mostly quiet for a good long while, but you helped steer us in the right direction, and I really appreciate that. That, you know, when it comes to moderation, it's either you're always interrupting people because they're so off topic, or doing what you did, which is basically sit quietly and it's like, hey, we need to kind of drive this way. And I thought you did a wonderful job, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I was quiet when you guys were kicking ass, and you guys kicked a lot of ass, so you didn't need me much. It was good.
Yeah, no, I'd like to echo that, Patrick. I really appreciate you doing this. It was really I was glad you were here for it, because it did help. You know, like you say, you were quiet for long periods because we were obviously hashing things out. But when the conversation needed guiding in certain directions, you did that in a way that really benefited the debate and helped it move along in a direction that I don't think it would have been as productive if you weren't here. So yeah, I really appreciate that.
Okay, we're all friends. Let's do this again sometime, gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you, mate. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Derek, as well, for taking part, and thank you anyone who's listening. I hope everybody involved has learned a little.